So your student has spent all of this time writing a great set of notes, but they don't remember any of it. How can we help our students write notes that they will actually remember? This is a big discussion. In fact, it's so big that I can't do it justice in just this video. I won't be able to tell you exactly how to write notes in a way that is cognitively perfect. That's something that normally when I train students in takes hours of instruction and coaching and feedback and practice to start developing. But there are some easy things that we can do that make a very big difference for not too much effort. And I'll share those with you. Now, I'm quite into my photography. I like taking photos. I like taking photos that look interesting, that come from a unique angle, an angle on the same thing that everyone else isn't seeing. When I take a photo, I think about what lens I'm going to use, what the lighting looks like. I think about what zoom I want to have it in. I think about the composition of the photo. What's in the foreground? What's in the background? What type of mood and tone that I want to set for this photo? It can take me a long time to take a photo. Some photos I might be sitting up for minutes or even an hour just to get the right setup for a series of photos that I really want to capture, an idea in my mind that I want to bring to life in that photo. It's a hobby of mine. When I go hiking or tramping with my friends, we'll go into this nice forest with a beach out that we can see, and I'll take my camera out, set up my tripod, and think about all of these things, and 15 minutes later, I've got some photos that I think are quite nice. My friends, on the other hand, they just pull out their phone. They get their phone and they just take a few snaps here, there, a few over there, and they've got 10, 15, 20 photos that they've taken. A month passes, a couple months pass, and I'll say to my friends, hey, you remember that time that we went to that walk and we saw that particular scene and how there was that guy off in the distance that was doing something? And they'll say, well, I don't remember that at all. Well, when did we go there? When did we do that? What guy are you talking about? And I'll say, hey, remember, we took some photos. Hey, have a look through your photos, and they'll find it. They'll look through their photos, and of the 40 photos that they took, there's one of them that shows what I was talking about. And maybe I only took 6 or 7. And I'll say, hey, look, yeah, this photo that I'm looking at right here. Now, why was that? Why was it that I was able to remember that particular moment in that photo when my friends weren't able to? They took more photos than I did. They took 40, 50, 200. I took 20 or 30. They had more photos, so why didn't they have better memory of it? So the thing is that when we think about how memorable information is, it's not about how many times we've documented it. It's not how many records of it that we have. What's important is a thought process that goes on at the time of recording it. When we make notes, what are we thinking about that has led us to write the notes? Are our notes just a spam of purposeless information that we're putting on paper because we feel insecure and we're anxious and we just feel like we need to have it on paper, otherwise we're going to forget it. And if it's on paper, we feel like, at least it's on paper now, I can relax. But in their mind, it's still not there. When it comes to note-taking, the conventional approach is that we write notes so that we don't have to think about it. When we write notes correctly, the note-taking process is meant to help us think about it. A completely different perspective. So don't ask, how can we help students write notes so that they remember it? Ask, how can we make students think so that they remember it? And how do we use notes to supplement that thought process? It has to start from in here. The thinking process is critical. Without the right thinking process, even the best note-taking technique will not be effective, or at least not as effective as it could be. And this is the reason why a lot of great note-taking methods, some students will use and they'll say, oh, it doesn't work for me. But then there are some note-taking methods that the student is already using that they already feel like isn't working for them. But then there's another student that does the exact same type of notes and they seem to be doing very well. The difference is what goes on in here. And that's, again, where we need to be operating as well. So how do you write notes to facilitate the right type of thinking process? Well, first of all, what is the right type of thinking process? As we have discussed in the previous videos, the right type of thinking process is the thinking involved in higher order learning. So again, if you're not familiar with the Bloom's revised taxonomy, make sure to go and check that out again, review the previous video, look at the resources, familiarize yourself because it's very important. It's important not only for this activity, but also for the self-reflection activities and for the types of questioning that we're going to get our students to do and prompting for metacognition. All that stuff we've already talked about. That's very important that you understand the difference between higher order and lower order learning and higher order and lower order thinking. So as a very, very brief recap, higher order learning that's integrated. And so we're doing a lot of evaluation. We're comparing, we're contrasting, finding similarities and differences. We're grouping information. We're prioritizing information. We're making judgments about the information. We're really critiquing it. And no piece of information exists in isolation. So that type of thinking can require a lot of cognitive effort, a lot of brain power. And that's, again, what we call cognitive load. And so when cognitive load gets too high, it becomes unhelpful. When it's too low, arguably, it's even less helpful. Note-taking is useful because it can help us manage that cognitive load. Let's say that we've been introduced to 5 new ideas in this class. 5 new ideas. And that, depending on how you view this, that may seem like a lot or it may seem like not a lot. But if you have 5 brand new concepts that you've been introduced to in just a single lecture, that's quite a lot. So your student is thinking about these concepts and they're thinking, well, what does it mean? How is it relevant? How does it relate to each other? And they should be, with your encouragement, thinking about, well, how are these concepts similar or different to each other? How can I group them? Which ones are more important or less important than the others? And when they're doing this, they may have multiple ideas. Maybe this is related to this concept and this concept. Or maybe it's related to those, but maybe that's less important than how it's related to this concept instead. Or maybe it's that these 2 concepts can actually be grouped together into a larger group. And then that's related to these 2 concepts. Maybe that's the most important way to represent these ideas. So they may have all of these different ideas, and that's a lot to think about. And so we can use note-taking to help that. We can say, okay, maybe this or this. Okay, let me note that down. It could be this. Or maybe it's this and this. So let me note that down as well, this or this. Or it could be these 2 together and then this and this. Let me note that one down as well. And now we've done the right type of thinking and we're putting it on paper so that we're not having to just hold on to all of that in our head while we're learning more information. Something that you can do in class to help this, on top of obviously designing your lessons and your explanations to make it easier for the students to understand what concepts there are, and making it clear in terms of what new terminology, and then defining them, and then asking them to look for similarities and differences, is to give them time intermittently. Let's say you've introduced a few new concepts, then you might say at the end of the class, spend 10 minutes taking these new pieces of terminology that they've learned today and just draw a little map to see how it might all relate together, what the relationship could be. And that type of activity can be very, very powerful, even if it's only 10 or 15 minutes, or even if it's only 5 minutes. In fact, you might not even do this every single class. You might do it every single week. But my recommendation would be that if you know that your students are not familiar with this type of thinking, do it more frequently because it's going to help train their ability. And if you do it at the end of a week and they're trying to do it for an entire week's worth of learning, that's going to be much more difficult for a beginner than just doing it for 1 or 2 classes worth of learning. If you're working with students that are much more capable, you definitely can do it at a weekly level or a topic-wide level. You'd obviously just need to spend a little bit longer, maybe 30 minutes or 40 minutes instead of just 5 or 10 minutes. What we've talked about right now is this technique of offloading that cognitive load with the hypotheses, the ideas of higher order learning structures. Those of you that are familiar with solo taxonomy, which talks about the different types of knowledge structures that a learner develops as they become more and more advanced and masterful over a topic, you'll see how this is helping them to create relationships to eventually work their way up the solo taxonomy. By using notes in this way, we can see that it can help to facilitate the thinking process. They've got some ideas on the paper, they can look back at those ideas, they can add some more ideas to it, and they've got a canvas that they can work off. It's giving them some feedback. And every now and again, they can bring it together and consolidate things. They had all the, 10 different ideas, and then they're able to say, okay, this one doesn't make sense, this one doesn't make sense. Maybe it's just these 3 are the ones that seem better, or maybe not all 10 of them are wrong, but now that I've thought about it, I figured out the right structure that does make sense for me moving forward. And then they'd focus on that one. And then they continue to build that. So after they learn more, they build it, they refine it, they build it, they refine it, on and on and on. But there's another aspect to writing notes, which is not just to facilitate the thinking, but is to serve as a record of information for future studying. This is simply reference material. This is something that isn't in the textbook, isn't in the guide, isn't in a single central source, but it's something that you might have spoken about in class that you feel the student needs to remember or hold on to or think about. And the student will write all of that down because they don't want to lose that information. Ideally, you don't really want this to be the situation. If possible, it's better to give your student a single piece of a document or a book or a course book or a guidebook or a textbook chapter or something that actually has all of the relevant information that they need to know in it. The fear that some teachers have is that if you give all the information to the student, they're not going to engage, they're not going to think in class. But the problem is that if the type of thinking that the student is doing in class is only the lower order learning, then it's true. If all you are is a delivery of information, then it's true. They don't actually need to be in class if they can receive that information elsewhere. So the trick is not to withhold the information. It is to make the class time more valuable by engaging the higher order thinking that they may struggle with doing by themselves, or even if they're good at it, they can get the value of doing it as a group or with their peers. So that's where the value of class should be. It should be more about the collaboration, about the discussion, about the higher order thinking, the evaluation, the question and answer, the exploration, the inquiry process. These are the things that class is very valuable for, where your explanations are more targeted and more focal. You don't want to just be spending all of your time just delivering information only. Yes, you have to deliver information. This is not a postgraduate university workshop where all you can do is simply have an open discussion. Secondary school education does not work that way. You still have to deliver information, but it's about how we're facilitating that and what type of thinking we get them to do while they're receiving this information. So we don't want them to feel like they need to write down everything in case they miss it. It does not help with learning to simply just write. If you're too busy just writing, you don't have time to just think about it. And there is a myth, and this is an old school, outdated way of thinking, which is that if the student is writing notes, they will remember it more. Okay, yes, they may remember it more compared to doing absolutely nothing and not even thinking about it. But I will tell you for a fact that if a student is thinking about it right, they will remember more writing no notes than a student thinking about it at a lower level and writing heaps of notes. And the difference is that if the student who is thinking about it is forced to write notes all the time, they're going to find class is not engaging for them. The student that is not thinking at all and they're writing notes because the teacher is forcing them to, but they're also not thinking about it, they're also not really learning much from class. So it's a lose-lose situation. The only way that we win is to make the value of the class more geared towards higher order thinking, higher order learning. However, if there's a situation where the student does need to write notes to just hold on to information, for example, this is very common in university with big lectures and huge lecture halls, and the lecturer is not really necessarily trying to even make it easy for the students, and you do have to get that information because it's not going to be anywhere outside of the lecture. These days, there is lecture recordings that people can go through. There's AI that people can use to transcribe a lecture recording and then pull out the relevant points to create a set of written notes for them. A lot of educators will look on that with disdain, thinking, oh, you have to be in the lecture and all of that sort of stuff. Personally, I don't agree because I know that what's most important is just what happens in here. As long as the student is doing this, how the information comes in is not really so relevant. And most educators, they're not great at facilitating the higher order learning anyway. So personally, I feel that it's a good thing that students are able to use their time more efficiently. There are plenty of lectures, and let's be honest, we all know this. There are plenty of lectures or classes that you sit in and you attend for an hour and you think, I really didn't need to come to this. I didn't learn anything. It would have been much better for me to just read a summary of it, and I would have learned just as much, if not more. And it would have taken me half of the time. So I think empowering the students with those tools is a good thing as long as they know how to use those tools If you give students these tools, but they don't know how to use them, that's problematic because now they're skipping the parts that might force them to do something, but they're also not of their own volition. They're not voluntarily doing the right type of thinking themselves either. So that can become problematic. However, if there's a situation where these reference style notes have to be written, those types of notes completely can be just typed because the value of that information is just having it somewhere for reference. We don't need that information to be processed at that higher order. Most information is a mix. There's some parts of information where it's very, very certain specific detail. It doesn't seem super relevant right now. We just want to document it. Maybe we come back to it later to think about even further. But at the time, we're trying to do our higher order thinking and learning, and it doesn't really seem to fit somewhere. And so we just quickly document that, and we can just type that out. Whereas when it comes to grouping and bringing information together, that's information that we don't really want to be typing out. And this brings me to the next point, which is the idea of writing non-linear notes. Knowledge is not linear. No knowledge is really linear. And the only reason that we're used to learning it linearly is because 500-600 years ago, the printing press was invented, and then books became the way to learn. And because of the printing press, it just so happens that it reads from one side of the page to the next, going down the page linearly. But the knowledge, to begin with, is not linear. The knowledge of a true expert does not happen in a single direction down a page. It's silly to think that. And so what we want for our students is not to just take the linear form of the knowledge and just remember it linearly and then try to somehow make it like a true expert. We actually want them to recognize that the linear form is limited. It's not optimal. The optimal form would be to hook up the person's brain of an expert with the student and just directly transfer the knowledge across. If you did that, the knowledge wouldn't be linear. And so the fact that we're having to represent and teach knowledge linearly is a limitation. We shouldn't be applying that limitation to our note-taking. I don't know if any of you have read Lord of the Rings. It's a very popular movie and book series. And in Lord of the Rings, there is a certain door. And in the book, there is 1 to 2 whole pages just describing what that door looks like. The feel, the color, the material, the texture, the vibe, the atmosphere around that door. In the movie, it's about 7 seconds of footage. Here's the door. This is what it looks like. And you know what? The movie does a great job. They say that a picture speaks 1,000 words, but if you think about it in terms of learning, knowledge is more than just a picture. Knowledge is multiple concepts interacting with each other, and these interactions are dynamic. They're not fixed. This interaction is relevant for one context or one application, but in another context, that interaction is different. It's no longer as important. There's something else to think about. This is the true nature of knowledge. Now imagine trying to describe that in sentences and paragraphs. It would be overwhelming. It's essentially impossible to try to do that. And this is why non-linear note-taking is much more effective. With non-linear note-taking, we have more tools at our arsenal. We can use position on the page, arrows, arrangement to show ideas. If some ideas are very related to each other, we can physically have them close to each other. If they contribute to something else, we can draw an arrow going to it. If it goes through another process, that arrow can pass through something else. If one of those relationships is very direct, we can draw a strong arrow. If the other one is a little less direct, we can draw a thinner arrow. We can show so many complexities of knowledge with spatial arrangement and non-linear mapping. Now, this is commonly called a mind map, but actually there are many, many different ways of doing the mind map. The mind map is not a single technique. There are many different forms of mind mapping, and to be totally honest, many of the forms of mind mapping that I have seen that have been taught and recommended do not work because they are cognitively not optimized. They are very lower order, and the biggest benefit of mind mapping, which is to enhance higher order learning, seems to have been completely removed from the technique to make it easier to do. And again, that easy to do has actually stripped it of the benefit that it could have provided. And so I don't really recommend all of those. I do have some additional videos on mind mapping that I can recommend. I'll check some of the links in the description to this as well. So you can have a look through that if you want to know a little bit more in detail about it. Again, I'm not able to go into the technique detail too much in this video because it is quite long, but at the very least, please do not promote linear note-taking in your classes. When you teach, please do not teach with linear notes. Use non-linear notes yourself. Be a role model for your students to learn from. I never teach with linear notes. In fact, I don't think I have ever taught with linear notes because it didn't seem to make sense to me from the beginning. What I noticed was that my students, without me, before I even started thinking about all of this stuff, when I was first teaching and I was just purely focused on teaching in the conventional sense, my students, their notes were just much higher quality. They were writing non-linearly because they saw how I was expressing the ideas and they saw for themselves how limiting it would be to try to represent that information linearly, how long it would take for them to type out all of that. But if what you're doing is you're teaching it linearly and then your students are just copying that, then that's going to create many more problems down the line. So promote non-linear note-taking, role model non-linear notes in your teaching. Encourage your students to do non-linear notes and try not to tell your students to write non-linear notes as part of an activity. You can even make it a formative assignment for your students. Take this concept, take this chapter, take this section, this article, and I want you to create a map of the main concepts and how you think they fit together. And then bring that into class, compare it with the peer, get into groups, look at who has a relationship that someone else didn't think about, right? You can make it a competition. All of these things, there are so many different pedagogical activities that we can introduce that we're all familiar with, but when we apply it for higher order learning tasks, they become so much more engaging. They don't become just that task that it's a checklist. Oh, I think I've done it, but actually your students still look like they're not really engaged in the process. Lower order learning is never engaging. You can't dress it up anyway to make it more engaging than it inherently is. It is just cognitively not an engaging process and you can't force that. And the final thing is how your students are using their notes. There's a very common technique called the 3 C's technique. It stands for cover, copy, check. Notes are written down, the notes are covered. The person tries to recall it. Sometimes they copy it out again, and then they check if they got the right answer. This is very common. Why? Because there is some research that showed that this was effective. Now, that research was for young children, and it is very limited in the effectiveness. The cover, copy, check method, or really any method that simply involves repeating, retaining for a short period of time, and simply regurgitating is not suitable for higher order learning. Because in here, there is nothing evaluative, comparative, nothing higher order is going on. It is simply a low level, memorize, regurgitate. We don't want to be promoting that sort of thing. And we don't need to. Remember, when we try to do higher order thinking, lower order thinking and lower order learning happens automatically because it's not possible to compare two things with each other if you don't even remember what those two things are. As part of the process of trying to aim for higher order learning, we'll find gaps in our lower order learning anyway. And when we fill them, those are much more relevant, and therefore that information will be held onto much more strongly. I believe that one day we will look back on the way that we emphasize lower order learning and repeating and regurgitating and just memorizing and understanding. We will think about that with the same way that we think about just telling a student to say things 100 times and hitting them with a cane every single time they get it wrong. Psychologically, all the research says it doesn't really work, especially not for the needs of a modern learner. Again, summary of the main points as well as some additional guidelines that can help you in your practice will be provided in the PDF. Check the description for that link.